I'd like to introduce you today to my brand new loom. I designed it specially and Cindy Wood Looms made it for me. If you've watched me in the past, you will know that I have knitted on quite a lot of looms and even designed one to make yourself. Mine is a good double knitting loom and inexpensive to make. I also love knitting on Kiss looms. They're excellent. And a lot of the things that I plan to show you on my new loom can be done on a similarly configured loom. I first developed many of these techniques working on a Purple Nifty Knitter double rake, which configured similarly to this one. My reason for wanting this new design was so that single knitting and double knitting would work equally well on the new loom, and they could be used in the same project at the same time. I am going to quickly show you some of the things I'm going to be working on, but in case you want to know how this particular loom was made, I imagine Cindy would make you one too. I will put the specs for it on my website, and there will be a link in the program notes for this video to the website. Here I'm doing plain old stockinette knitting. I'm using my favorite version of the knit stitch for this kind of loom, which is a U-stitch, just a pronounced up and over movement that causes the yarn, which is freely flowing, to wrap in a U shape around each peg. That's why it's important for this kind of knitting to have pegs with a solid dimension. That determines, along with the distance between the pegs, the size of your knit stitch if you like to knit as I do. Certainly other styles of knit stitch are workable on this kind of loom. This is just my personal preference. I'm using a soft number 5 yarn. This loom has 5/8 inch peg spacing from center to center, and it produces a very pretty stocking stitch or stockinette stitch or plain knit stitch, whatever you like to call it. But on this loom, we can transition directly into another stitch, and we're going to be able to make ribbing type stitches without any purling. How can this be, you may wonder? It is because the back of a knit stitch is a purl stitch, and the back of a purl stitch is a knit stitch. On 2 needles, the only way to get smooth stockinette is to knit the purl rows backwards because we shift from needle to needle. But if you have opposing boards, as you have on this setup and all double knitting boards, I'm making knit stitches now, but when I make something formed in exactly the same way on the opposing board, they will be purl stitches. This time I'm actually not making regular ribbing, which is knit 1, purl 1. I'm making half fisherman's rib, in which we knit every row on one of the boards, but allow the stitches to build up, the loops actually to build up for a second row on the opposing board. And we only knit that pair of loops off every other row. Here we now have 3 wraps on each peg. 2 are moving over the top of the third one, and now we wrap again. Now this coming row, we'll wrap every one of the working pegs. I'm using every other peg here, and that is not the only kind of ribbing we can make. More about that later. But the front board, the board nearest me, and you if you're sitting in my position, is knitted off every row, while the back board is knitted off every other row. This is called either half fisherman's rib or English rib, and it makes a fabric that's really soft, cushy, thick, and much, much wider than the same number of stitches knitting stockinette. This sample began with stockinette, moved on to knit 1, purl 1 ribbing, only we didn't actually have to purl, widened out as we went to half fisherman's rib, and then even wider as I changed to knitting full fisherman's rib. And from there, I went on to do some cabling. So let's return to knitting. Now I'm working simply knit 1, purl 1 rib. We will wrap every one of the pegs that we're using this time and knit every one of them over every time. Again, purls are being created, but we're not actually doing that wrist twisting, reaching through the stitch and pulling up the new wrap. This board has an extra set of holes so that I could align the boards differently. That would allow the pegs to alternate positions even if every single peg was in work, and that would make a closer, tighter ribbing. There are a couple of nice things about not needing to purl in the traditional loom knitting way. One is it's easier on your hands, especially people with arthritis will find it so. And while I don't really think we should be thinking of speed primarily when we're doing handwork, it can be encouraging to see the work developing faster, and it does using this no-purl purling method. We really are purling, just not in the usual way. It's the fact that the pegs are on two opposing boards and they are wrapped in opposing directions that makes the ribbing happen. To make full fisherman's rib, also known sometimes as double English rib, we're going to wrap in the same manner every single row, but each time we wrap, we will knit off only one board. So the front board doesn't get knitted every row this time, it gets knitted every other row. Therefore, it will also pick up 2 loops of yarn before we knit over, as the back one does. And the result is that 2 loops will be being knitted over at the same time every time we knit a row. This makes the widest possible fabric. It can end up substantially wider than the width that you're working across the pegs. The fabric is also very, very soft, very thick, and very, very warm, because what makes knitting warm is it captures little air pockets, and double English rib or full fisherman's rib catches the maximum air possible. I've experimented with 2 types of cables here, the lattice cable and a 3-stitch cable. Each of them are going to get their own movie shortly, so I will just briefly touch on the 3-stitch cable. The ability to combine single knitting stitches, which the cable is, with double knitting stitches, as I am doing here, is the main reason that I really wanted a board like this. The pegs are big enough, which when I make my own looms out of cotter pins, they are not, to make a well-formed stockinette stitch. Those are needed to make cables. At least it's my favorite way. There is such a thing as double board cables, which I will show you on another occasion. Because I have the 2 boards opposing one another, I can simultaneously work fisherman's rib or half fisherman's rib as a background, and I can do it without the wrist twisting version of the purl stitch, at the same time as creating a single knitted cable on the front board, the board nearest me. For this project, I am E-wrapping the cable stitches only. Using the E-wrap makes those stitches a little bit longer than they would be in my usual favorite U-wrap, which is going to make them easier to cable or to trade positions when the time comes. Having half fisherman's rib means that a couple of loops will build up on the stitches, the purl stitches that are next to the cable before we knit them off. That will make those wider than regular purl stitches would be. Tucking stitches, which is allowing loops to build up and then knitting off multiples at once, makes that purl stitch wider than a regular purl stitch would be. The width gives us more room to get a look at the cable that is centered between those purls. So we get a little bit of extra drama, both for texture and for width. And we get a really good look at all the hard work that we put into the cable. To cross the cable, I'm first moving the 3 stitches that are involved to the back pegs, then moving the one that began on the right all the way to the left, and the other 2 to the right. You will be seeing some more videos shortly with details on how to turn these techniques that I've just given you a little overview of into beautiful garments, scarves first, progressing up to modular sweaters. I can already tell I'm going to love my special loom, but don't forget you can practice these things on any loom that has 2 rows of opposing pegs.